Sue and Sean show is where we're going to start, and I'm going to hand over to them jointly because I don't know whether they've decided which order even they're going to go in, but I know they've got a strategy, and they're going to stimulate our conversation. And it's lovely to see you both again. So, who's gonna start?
I'm going to suggest Sue starts as the Sue part of the Sue and Sean show. She can go first.
We were joking beforehand that it was the Sean and Sue show, you see, so there's been a bit of playing around. Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, but it's lovely to see some familiar faces on the screen. I'm Sue Osborne. I work for the School for Social Entrepreneurs 3.5 days a week. And then I work as a freelancer for the other day and a half of the week. So my freelance work covers impact consultancy, coaching, facilitating action learning sets, various other aspects that come into it. But I guess really what I'm here talking about is in my School for Social Entrepreneurs role, what I've seen and observed across the social enterprise sector, particularly in the last year. I have worked within the sector for about 20 years now. I worked originally in the sector for shared interests. It's really lovely to see Tracy alongside here from our days back there. And then, have worked in a number of sort of different freelance roles and moving into the SSE. All through those 20 years, I've had an interest around monitoring, evaluation, measuring the impact that organisations are having. We did some great work initiated at Shared Interest that's then gone on to evolve, and they produce some fabulous social accounts every single year. And both Tracy and I have worked as social auditors with them. I've had the privilege to work with Matthew and NMC as a social auditor too. So lots of different sort of aspects of social accounting and social audit. Most of my impact consultancy, certainly over the last 5 years, has been working with Sean. So Sean, I work as an associate of Sean's organisation, and we've worked with a really wide range of organisations, but I will hand over to Sean and allow him to do that introduction and talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So, hello everybody. As you know, I'm Sean, Director of Enriched Consulting, and been sort of doing Enriched Consulting now for the last 5 years as a freelance consultant, focusing on impact measurement and business strategy and so on. But before that, and for the last sort of 24 years or so, I've worked across the statutory sector, not-for-profit organisations, the charity sector, doing a real range of roles from frontline services and homelessness and support, through to more strategic roles, and then to sort of director of a charity. And in that time have very much seen the shift from just reporting the outputs, the numbers, and the number of people that you're working with on the ground, right through to starting to introduce the outcomes into services. So starting to understand the difference that's been involved. For the last, I think, 13 years, I've been actively involved in impact measurement. I started my journey with impact measurement so when I was working for a not-for-profit organisation that was wanting to basically review everything it was doing and determine, what difference is it actually making. We did a bit of research, found social accounting and auditing as a tool that could be used, and we started to introduce that within the community investment arm of the organisation, and we managed to review, I think it's about 20 odd services using social accounting, and we did that about 3 or 4 times, where we were embedding that data collection right through the process. We started to then explore that a little bit further and started looking at social return on investment and started to amalgamate the two and seeing how we could bring that together and start to really look at all angles, really, to have a hybrid of what works for us as an organisation. And then, as I said, I've kind of moved from that organisation and took that into my independent consultancy, and have had the fantastic opportunity to work with Sue for the last 5 years on various projects, but also have worked with some amazing organisations up and down the country, whether it's been people that support people with mental health issues, people with physical disabilities and learning disabilities, whether it's been those who are economically inactive, social entrepreneurs. So a real sort of mixed bag of different people that I've been able to have the opportunity to work with and be able to sort of apply the evaluation methodologies to help them evidence the good work that they're doing. So yeah, that's me, I think.
Thank you both for your introductions and sharing your experiences. I think what we'd really like to do is to start a conversation where we take some reflections really from people about how you're feeling, how, you know, what have been the impacts on your organisation, your work, the people that you are connected with over the past year, and I guess more crucially, how are you seeing the future? How are you thinking now about the measuring of social impact, the demonstration of that? Is it more important, less important? Is it more or less difficult? What's your, does anybody want to kind of start the ball rolling and kind of give a view of where we're at?
Shall I jump in, Matthew, and maybe just do a kind of overall view, and then others, I'm sure, can sort of pick up their
Thank you, Sue.
perspectives. I think it's been a really interesting year to observe in terms of how things have evolved for different organisations within our broader sense of our sector. If I reflect on the organisations that we touch on as the School for Social Entrepreneurs, and we're working with approximately 1,000 social leaders every year, so we really cover quite a wide kind of section. If you go back to sort of a year ago when the pandemic first hit and where everybody was sort of really struggling, one of the big things, certainly for the social enterprises, was to try and get some kind of financial support. It felt like some of that initial support that came through was there for the commercial sector. After a period of time, some of the charities started to then see an opportunity for some funding, but the social enterprises really kind of missed out in terms of what that sort of funding piece would look like. I think if I reflect now on the sort of broader year, the funders have done their very best to meet some of those needs and support them, but I still think there's been ultimately some winners and losers in this sector. So there have definitely been some organisations who have just had to completely pause. They've just not been able to do anything. So there's an organisation I'm working with that supports people with learning disabilities in the hospitality sector. And that's just been a complete no on two levels. First of all, those young people have been shielding, but that sector has been arguably decimated over the last year and really tough for those people to engage. But then there's other social enterprises, like we've supported a surf school in South Shields that had the most amazing summer last year. With all of these people that have stayed in Britain, their business has thrived, they've done so well. Other organisations that have also thrived have been sort of organisations refurbishing bicycles. You know, so there's been some organisations that have been able to pivot and pilot different ideas. They've been able to come out of this with new ideas, but then there's been others that have just, you know, been incredibly challenged at this time. And I think, you know, that's just the sort of state of play really in terms of where organisations are at. I'm doing a little bit of work with a Yorkshire funder and supporting 8 of their grantees at the moment. And interestingly, their perspective is that they're feeling fairly buoyant at the moment, but their worry is about another year, 2 years down the line, when they feel like actually this is when it's going to really hit. The money that's been brought forward to support them will no longer be there. They're not sure what this whole space that they're working in is going to look like. So I guess from where I sit at the moment, I see some of this sort of polarization that we have in our country stretching even more into different ways in different sectors. But yeah, happy to hear Sean's views or others' views,
I was
whatever's.
going to say, yeah, just to add to that, Sue, thank you. I think obviously what you're saying there, obviously the landscape has just been shifting. People are having to deal with something that has been totally unprecedented and they haven't had to deal with before. And I think because of that, a lot of established organizations have had to almost go back to that innovation element of, right, okay, what we were doing worked in the environment that we were working in before, when we could work face to face and we could do stuff with people. But okay, we've got a lot of vulnerable people who are in need of the support still. How do we do that? How do we get around all these barriers to still support those who are most in need? And I think that some of the organisations that I've been doing some work with and observed, they have been able to almost hit that reset button and just kind of think outside the box and go, okay, let's just kind of say, how can we work around this and how can we still work with people? They've continued to do some fantastic work by adapting their services. But I think a key part of that moving forward is going to be, well, does that adapted service continue in its adapted form? Or does it revert back to as it was before? And as part of that innovative piece, okay, how do they measure that that's been working and it's actually been doing what it needs to do? So you might have had a number of organizations who've, as I said, have gone from that settled service delivery offer and have an outcomes framework in place, which is very sort of well tested, but they're having to move back into that innovation space and that developmental evaluation where they're having to think about what is next, how are we adapting? And as Sue said, we're not out of it. The next sort of 12 to 18 months in terms of funding and so on is a big issue. So staying in that innovation and developmental stage could be keeping going for a lot longer.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond personally, because we're an organisation that had been in quite a kind of good rhythm of doing social accounting and audit on an annual basis, and we felt that was kind of the way to go, and we hadn't anticipated doing anything other than continuing with it. And this last year, the connection with individuals and the ability to actually get feedback from people within the community that we're serving, I don't know, I could say it was difficult. I just felt people had better things to do and more, than spending time giving feedback to our organisation. I felt I was imposing much more than I had previously, and that so we ended up, we produced a booklet which sort of looks like our social accounts, but it's more a history of the last year. It's more a document that I just felt we needed to get it down on paper, what we'd done. And it is more of a history than a reflection of impact. I mean, you read it, there's clearly stuff in there about the impact on individuals and quotes from people who have volunteered stuff. Yeah, I suppose I'm just expressing that it hasn't been an easy thing to measure the impact in our organisation. Others may be different. Adrian, you put something in the chat box there. Do you want to flesh that out and express it to us?
My wandering fingers on a keyboard always gets me.
Well, thank you.
No, this kind of echoes something that kind of struck me a few weeks ago. So I guess the background and the context to this is two things. One is, as has been mentioned, this last year, we've seen just about every grant making body shift their priorities and criteria for what they'll fund in terms of response, which has been brilliant. I have a slight concern within that, in that if as organizations, we are regulated, so we are charities or KICs, how far have we actually been doing stuff illegally? Because as charities or KICs, not only our purposes, but our activities are regulated by those regulatory bodies. And if we didn't have the respective regulators' permission to be doing those activities, they were technically outside of our authorised powers, which raises interesting implication questions for any funder who's been complicit in making that happen. Then the other bit that kind of went behind this is I'm a bit odd in a number of ways, as anyone who's looked into my background will know. One of the things is every year for the last 15 years, I've published a report on myself as a freelance practitioner about my own impact in terms of how my business model works. And so a couple of years ago, Social Value UK picked this up and said, this is a leading example of how to do integrated impact reporting. I still don't know what that means, but it sounds impressive. But what struck me when I came to do it this year was I've always used the same measures and methodologies. So I've got a 15-year trending average, say every year I've measured impact or value creation with certain groups in certain ways consistently. And every year I source external benchmarks to those as well. So it struck me that over this last year, I've been able to kind of say, how far would I expect to have created impact and value under certain themes based on the 15-year average? And then when COVID's come along, how far has that knocked it off? Which gives me that point to say, how far are the practices I'm adapting, maintaining, creating impact and value, and how far should I try and rein them back and pull it another way? So just because I can do it and that keeps paying the bills, is it still the best way to do it? And I have confidence in that review because I'm measuring it and reflecting on it with the same people in the same way consistently. But what I'm seeing and hearing, in terms of the example you just gave, Matthew, about that kind of summary reflective narrative to supplement it is brilliant. But my sense is that's what most of us have been doing, which makes it harder to then get the best value out of this reporting we're doing on ourselves to help us inform our future planning and strategy. So I was just kind of curious to put that out. Very long-winded, sorry, should have had diagrams and dancing bands and things to go with it to make it more interesting. But I was just curious to know if other people in the conversation here, in terms of your experience and involvement with tracking value and impact, how far have you been able to maintain consistency over this last year with what you've been doing previously, and what's that started to suggest? Or how far has it been, we have to triage this and the fire's too big and let's just focus on stopping more people falling over, and what the balance is between that?
Thanks, Adrian. Just before I ask if anybody wants to come in and respond to that, can I just welcome, I see a couple of folks who've joined and perhaps just missed my introduction. There's Sheena, I think. Hi there. And hi, Choi. Yes, you're very welcome. Where are you? I'm sensing maybe you're in another part of the world, or?
Yes, I'm in Korea, South Korea.
Fantastic. Very welcome.
Yeah,
well, you'll certainly help us broaden our perspective. And can I just check, is there anybody else who's joined us from outside of the UK? Okay. That just helps give us context. Did anybody want to respond to the points that Adrian had raised there? No? Or, how important?
Sorry, Matthew, can I just add something there? Just
please do.
In terms of what Adrian was saying there about people obviously sort of setting up almost a triage type approach. I've been doing some work with a national charity who have almost they had to totally, obviously, again, reinvent what they were doing, but they reined in significantly a lot of their services, which were about being sort of very proactive and obviously improving people's sort of physical disabilities and so on, their sort of symptoms. And so rather than adopting a triage approach to dealing with the imminent crisis and situation, they reined in a lot of their services, looked at how they could deliver alternative services, but didn't necessarily meet the need of the people that were out there. As evaluators, people were telling us what they needed and what they wanted, and the kind of impact that lockdown, for example, was having on them physically and mentally. And that was being fed back into the organization to say, like, this could be really enhanced, this could be improved. But as an organization, they took a decision to really rein things in and not have that triage approach of dealing with the immediate crisis in front of them, but just to kind of offer almost a very remote service. And that was it. That was their decision. They put their line in the sand, and kind of that was where they were coming from. So rather than, as I said, being very responsive, made the decision early doors, and it didn't shift on that sort of decision until lockdown started to ease and things started to sort of get a bit better, and they were looking at things. So I think again, that's just another example of how different organizations are responding in different ways, rather than looking at it as a crisis, pulling back and not dealing with that immediate need.
That's great. Thanks, Sean. Does anybody else want to make a contribution? Take this conversation forward.
Matthew, if I may come in, I'm Lisa McMillan, and as well as being involved with SAN, I work at the Women's Organisation. So we're a women's economic development agency based in Liverpool, and we manage and collaborate with partners to deliver a range of enterprise and employment related projects. And I think, coming back to what Sean and Sue have said, and Adrian's question of how we've had to do things differently, and it's almost been much more different. We've had to respond differently on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, because the impacts on our clients have been so vast, I suppose, but also so different. And you can see that the responses, and therefore the impact of the situation on different groups that we would work with is different. So we've had to be much more flexible. We've had to be much more responsive. We've had to be very respectful of actually what is a priority in individuals and partner organizations' lives. And as Sean has just shown us, organizations have worked and responded in very different ways. And some of them have taken some time to be able to do that. But also, I think by maintaining some kind of engagement with our clients or the people that we're working with, the process itself of consulting has actually provided us with a mechanism where the services that they wanted was something different. They didn't want a service at a particular, this time last year, people were not necessarily thinking about how to get themselves into a job or how to set up their business. They were reacting or responding. But by consulting and engaging, it kept us, it provided a mechanism or a tool for us to be able to maintain that contact. And actually the impact of that is much wider and far reaching than we ever anticipated in the first program. So I think we have a real challenge to capture all of that, but also to be, to recognize the breadth of the impact, and comes back to, I think it was Sean that said about really understanding the needs of the people that we're working with and trying to reach, so that we could shape our projects or our activities to meet that. So I think there has been a change, and we've had to respond to be able to capture information that is actually helpful for us going forward. So it was really just that comment. I see Adrian in Nottingham has a comment to make as well, if you want to come in.
Yeah, thank you. It's Adrian from Bolton, actually. So surname is Nottingham. Another Adrian, lots of Adrians talking. There we go. Yeah, just some reflection. So I work for Bolton CVS. So social value, quality and impact is my kind of area. And just picking up what you said, Lisa, we very early on created a tool which was basically a very abridged 2-page impact reporting tool, working on the basis that as we went through pandemic, as we were right in the middle of it, perhaps just looking at 3 months at a time and sort of driving out the learning as a really key part of that impact. And I think that kind of harmonizes with you as well, Matthew, in terms of just of the journey of what is happening, what are we learning, including some of the outputs and the outcomes, but really learning was the kind of key point there, and sort of saying we can do it 3 months at a time, but it's early days. On what, we're still in the middle, well, we hope we're progressing, but in terms of understanding the effects, it's still fairly early days, and it's going to take, as we've probably already said, quite a lot longer before we can look back. So a kind of a short version of just trying to hold on as the wind was blowing extremely strongly. A couple of things. Well, one really encouraging thing I think picking up is that looking forward in terms of how we'll be looking at, will there still be an emphasis, and will there be an increased emphasis on measuring impact? I think very encouragingly, just seeing that the lottery in their reaching communities are insisting that organizations budget for impact reporting. So not allowing groups to progress in terms of getting reaching communities significant grants without a clear budgeted strategy for how are they going to measure their impact. And I think that's really encouraging. And I think what the lottery does, other funders will probably follow in due course. So I think it's becoming a very much a must do. Groups, certainly, you know, small and medium, are really kind of being drawn into that space. Slight concerns around the way that the good news around how local authority, NHS, and the kind of VCSE sector have collaborated. Slight concerns that in that good news, that some of our social enterprises and community groups, etc., are not being forced into a way of working and a way of reporting that suits local authority and NHS public bodies. And so actually there's kind of a bit of a push to report on, you know, on your activities in a way which I think doesn't perhaps fit wholly within our sense of what is of real value. So just kind of picking up a little bit of that. Great opportunities for groups, but are they being pushed into ways of measuring impact that are not the whole or full deal that we would like to see? And I think then onto that is the fact that the Public Services Act, you know, the Social Value Act, has kind of grown some teeth this year in January. And so from procurement for social enterprise, there's a kind of, again, a stronger lead in terms of how social value should be reported, in terms of COVID recovery, inclusion, etc. And whilst there's something to be welcomed, again, I just kind of have a slight concern that it will drive impact measurement in a way, again, that may not be what we kind of would see as capturing all of the value that an organization, social enterprise brings. So just some reflections there. Thank you.
Some cracking reflections. Thank you very much, Adrian. I think that challenge around that we own the impact measures that apply to our organization and that they're not imposed. I mean, that's a long and ongoing kind of tension in our world, isn't it? That probably many of us feel. It's interesting that you feel that might be amplified during the pandemic and so on. So that's very interesting reflection. Also interesting reflection there around social value and the procurement changes. And an interesting contribution from T'other Adrian on the chat box there about who's trusted more, and some interesting observations coming out that he's obviously seen around private businesses and public sector being seen to be more trusted than charities and community sector. And, you know, what's our response to that? So there's plenty of stimulus amongst those contributions to fuel further debate. So who would like to pick up one of those themes and take
We've got Matt is ready to ask a question, Matthew. So two Adrians, two Matthews. So Matt, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, it was just an observation from me. Hi, everybody. It was I'm Matt Richardson from the Growth Company. So I think the topic of social value, I think, is still a bit of an unknown with a lot of SMEs within Greater Manchester. So that education piece, I think, which has been mentioned in the chat, I think businesses perhaps don't know what they don't know, and perhaps do a lot of social value and impact within the business. They just don't call it social value or don't make that connection. So I do think there's a lot of education still to be done in this space. My concern then is the comment that someone had mentioned about the tools, is a business seeing a tool, seeing that it can measure the impacts. We can put some figures in and it'll churn out a figure for us that we can put towards tenders and bids, when perhaps they've not been kind of advised or given the broader spectrum of what's available to them, and is that tool the most appropriate tool for them as well. So that was just my feeding back from the businesses that we engage with, is my slight concern that tools that perhaps aren't most appropriate for them are being used. Perhaps the need to use that tool and what that business is using it for, whether it's transparency for the wider impact for the supply chain or their employees to see, and it goes into wider discussions around, certainly from an environmental perspective, around greenwashing, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, all those kind of things. But yeah, that's the observation that we're seeing a lot from businesses, that before we get into that, it's probably a little bit more education around what social value impact is, which is actually another one, is the differentiator between social value and social impact as well, and people understanding that too. So yeah, that was just my thoughts on that.
Can I jump in? Is that okay?
Yes, Liz, please
Go
do.
for it, Liz.
I think when we get wrapped up in tools and toolkits, we start to miss the point. We're churning data. We're not applying intelligence to the lives of the people that we're working with. So I have a kind of a morbid fascination with them. But I also know that they can lead me off down a rabbit hole that won't necessarily tell me what I really want to know about the way that lives have been changed. So I think that's interesting. And I certainly, with private sector clients, public sector clients, do have this conversation frequently about, well, show me the tool, show me the spreadsheet that I'm going to plug the numbers into, and it will give me the answer. The other thing that we've certainly noticed in our business and our clients over the last year is an enormous growth in the desire to report environmental impacts, whether that's on the back of the changes to the procurement legislation, I don't know, but there's definitely a really big appetite at the moment for people to say to us, yeah, the social stuff is great and we want to do all of that, but actually what our customers will judge us on is our environmental footprint, our environmental impact, because at the moment as consumers, our attention has been raised to, okay, am I buying products from an organisation that's living responsibly? Not necessarily, am I buying products from an organisation that looks after its staff or that is delivering, amazing outcomes for their clients? It feels as though it's, I don't know whether it's lazy consumerism for us just to go to that place first, but certainly we're seeing a lot of demand for that. And the folk at Good Economy have released an ESG framework that will become part of housing regulation, which is very much focused on environmental responsibilities of landlords. So I guess we're going to start to see a bit of a surge in that area too.
Anyone else like to contribute? I'm just trying to catch up on the messages too, to see if anybody. So if you're not tracking the chat box, please do.
I wonder while you're doing that, Matthew, I'd be interested to hear from Sue and Sean. I saw heads nodding in a lot of that conversation there, just on the reflections about the tools and what are people using at the minute. In your experience, what have you seen from the organisations that you're working with that is working well for them?
Yeah, I think this is just really, really interesting and really challenging at the same time. So the strengthening of the Social Value Act is, of course, welcomed. But I think for those of us that are sort of involved in the sector that hopes to benefit from this, it just feels like a step in the right direction. There is so much more to be done. And of course, the strengthening is really focused on procurement from central government and at sort of bids that are over 100K. So, you know, fairly sizable pieces. And it's open to interpretation. So in my role, I have the opportunity to engage with what's called the Leeds anchors. So these are significant organisations within Leeds, and I sit on their procurement committee, trying to encourage them to think about social value in a much deeper sense than they think about it at the moment. So a lot of their focus is on what they would call the Leeds pound, just making sure that money is spent in Leeds. A little bit further along from that, they might then think about trying to spend money with SMEs. But my language around taking that on again to all those fabulous organisations in the broader VCSE sector who are doing such amazing work on the ground and can really, you know, enhance and create huge impact. That's like a few more steps along the way. And I think, you know, a lot of the local authorities are choosing to use tools like, for example, the social value engine. And I, you know, on the one hand, I understand it. They're local authorities that are grappling with this idea of social value. Someone presents a tool, they think this can answer their questions, and so they use it. But actually, it only really goes part way. There's just so much more to be done around those kind of tools. So, you know, it's great then to see some of the other things that are coming up in terms of, other ideas that are out there in terms of how they can measure it. But I think the landscape is getting much more complex now. There are lots of different tools, lots of people sort of playing in this area, but talking with authority, and it's becoming quite challenging. And my personal view is that one of the big problems we have actually as a sector is we don't come together with a collective voice in a really powerful way. And so lots of us all lobby in lots of different ways and try to come behind different organizations, but we don't have that collective voice. And I think that's going to be really important for us as we move through this.
Yeah, just to add to a bit what Sue said, but also sort of touching on what Adrian was talking about before as well, about that there are so many people within the VCSE sector and so many small organisations, and there has been that big partnering with statutory organisations, local authorities, health services, some partnerships with in the private sector and so on, and things like the Social Value Act is, like Sue said, it's a step in the right direction. And I think what we need to be careful with is obviously not losing the how dynamic the small organisations within the VCSE can be. They're recognized, organisations are recognised for being very adaptable, very dynamic, very flexible. But the downside of those organisations is that they're constantly, a lot of the time, looking for funding and on this treadmill of one funding round to the next. And so if you imagine, for me, think, okay, if you took that pressure away, how much better could they be, and how much more impact could they have if they're not having to think about all that money all the time? So, that's one for the statutory sector of the central government to try and pick up and think about, because they are obviously meeting a need that's out there. So let's enable them to do that. And in relation to the tools that people have been talking about, I think I mentioned before, I'm very much a fan of sort of a hybrid approach to looking at what's out there in the landscape, but ultimately having a conversation with people and saying, okay, well, what is it you're trying to achieve? So when you're trying to evidence with an organization what their service or business offer is actually achieving, what their impact is, you can almost then start to sort of pick and choose what parts of different tools are right for that organization. And if a funder, for example, is asking for a very specific tool to be used, or a very particular approach to be used, right, we'll do that because that's what's being asked. But actually, what else as an organization do they want to know? How else are we going to ask it? How can we introduce some bespoke measurements which are about that organization, not just about whether it's Hacked or whoever else has kind of introduced these outcomes. They're very useful, absolutely fantastic, totally behind them, but they've got a sort of a place and a purpose in a certain kind of pocket. So, for example, again, I've been working with the national charity. We've used things like short active live surveys, which were developed through Sport England because it was Sport England funding. We've used things like the Warwick Edinburgh mental wellbeing surveys, because they want to track mental well-being. So as a funder was saying, right, this is what we want to know. Is increased physical activity linked to improved mental well-being? Well, let's use these tools, and this is what we want. But actually, the organisation said, yeah, but we want to know this, this, and this as well. So we took the tools that the funder wanted, but also said, right, well, we're going to introduce all these other questions as well, because as an organisation, we want to know, are we having an impact in this area? How can we collect information to inform future service provision? How do we move forward? So yeah, as those tools have a use, but as I said, I very much advocate a hybrid approach of using what is there, what's useful, but just kind of, you know, working with the individual organisations to do what's right for them as well.
Yeah, yeah. So do I. I echo that absolutely. Now, Sophie, you had an exchange in the chat box there. Would you like to just share with everybody your perspective, how you're seeing this debate?
Yeah, of course. I find it really interesting. So I'm quite new, I think, to social accounting on the grand scheme of things to everybody else that I've had on the call. I only just started really dipping my toes in this in January, so I can't really reflect based on pre-COVID and post-COVID. But with the conversation just then, I definitely think with the hybrid of tools is really useful, because I don't think one tool fits all for any organisation, depending on the impact that you're trying to measure. And I think specifically with the hats and toms is that it's only a fraction of the impact that you can measure using quantitative data. And I think talking to the voice of the people that you're trying to serve is definitely a more useful kind of route to go down in terms of measuring the impact of the organisation, is talking to those people on the ground.
Thank you. Can I just, separately picking up things from the chat box, just thank Karen for plugging the SAN climate crisis workshop scheduled for June the 23rd. So if you're interested in that, and following on from the conversation there about you know, how much measuring the environmental impact, and Liz was talking about particularly how that, so put that date in your diary, 23rd of June for our next workshop. Liz, you were also asking there in the chat box about what people thought might be the impact of the end of CCG, so the latest kind of deck chair reorganisation in the local NHS structure to integrated care, something or others, I can't remember what.
Integrated care systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think it's going to be interesting.
Anybody have a view on that? Or Liz, did you want to say something?
I think it's interesting because they're supposed to be focused. It's not about cutting budgets, it's about changing the way services are delivered, apparently. And it's about being driven by place. And if every activity that's undertaken is about tackling population inequalities, then we will end up with an apparently integrated system. And I'm just really curious, because at the moment you look across any particular place and you'd see a bunch of statutory providers, VCSE providers, and the folk who are sat around the table at the moment determining what will the boards of these ICSs look like and how will services get developed are predominantly statutory services, acute hospital trusts, those kinds of things. So it's just really interesting that we're doing a job of work, a lot of us out in those communities. Matthew, the work that you do, I mean, you know, no other bugger's doing what you're doing, Matthew. And I wonder how, you know, how engaged the CCG and the incoming ICS has been with you and others. So yeah, just think it's an interesting one.
Well, very, very, very little, I guess. And to a degree, though, we're quite content with that. You know, I don't really want to get too we haven't got the resources to be too embroiled with a bureaucracy, but you'll get a flavour of my take on all of this from the things I've said just. I can't get excited about those reorganisations. I want to be excited by changing people's behaviours, you know, seeing people in those positions and those organizations change their behaviors, that's what's going to change stuff in terms of getting rid of health inequalities and so on, not who's on what committee or how they're organized. But there you go. I get off my soapbox and allow somebody else. Anybody
We can invite
wants
Jane in to comment. She's got her hand up.
Yes.
Thank you, Jane.
Hi,
Oh, well spotted. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on from that, Matthew and Liz, in that I was involved with, sorry to everyone who haven't known Jane Gibbon. I'm at Newcastle University and I work in the business school, but we did some research on the social impact bond that was used for social prescribing. And I mean, our conclusions were that it was a failure, but within that there was masses of measurement, because the whole thing was pivotal on actually being able to demonstrate social impact, social value and change, and that you had changed people's behaviors. So there is some really interesting work out of that that's critical of the social impact bonds, which is, that I think is fairly conclusive. But there's also some really interesting work that's been done in the medical, I know it's academic, but on the medical side, about the actual change, which is the value in that some of the work, it did work, but also it really annoyed some people who were already doing it and didn't have to be part of that project, because there were you know, the things that were not necessarily being included. So I think that's just gives you an example. Well, and also a place-based, because it was Newcastle, it was in the city, but I just thought, you know, that might be a place to have a look.
Definitely. Thanks, Jane. I will. Thank you.
But it comes back down to that thing about tools and measurement, and that, you know, that everybody's wanting some panacea in that space. And yeah, I've always been critical of that, because I think that your social account needs to be adapted to your specific organisation and situation. And under these current circumstances, it's a really good example that actually we adapt. We have to when crises come along, and that you can't always have a set of accounts that are going to be measured, you know, year on year. And that's an age-old problem in financial accounting, is that last year's data is always an unreliable source anyway. We all know that when you come to finance. Anyway, I won't talk anymore, but in terms of the medical, I think there's some really interesting work there around, and it's written up exactly. And if you want, come back to me, you can find me, and I will, you know, I'll find the information. If you find that there's a paywall and you can't get to the access any of the articles or work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wise and welcome words. Thank you so much, Jane. Lovely to hear from you. Okay. Anybody else take us off on a different...
Matthew, can I make a reflection? And I think I'm really interested from today's comments and inputs, and I think what we're coming back to really reassures, apart from anything else, that, you know, that our SAN model is the reason we use it, and the reason that we are in this space talking about things, because we know it works. You know, we've got this framework, we've got this structure, and we've been able to adapt and respond over the last 20 odd years to fit those tools or techniques that have emerged or have developed into that framework, and to help us really to reflect, you know, our individual organizations working in different regions and localities that, you know, may have their own peculiarities, or, you know, we are working with particular target groups, and it allows us the flexibility to really explore them. But I also think I was really taken with what Sean was saying earlier as well. And it really forced me to think, you know, why do we do this? And it's, you know, it might be because it's a procurement issue and it will help us do whatever, but actually it's about making sure what we do and what we provide and the services that are the correct ones, are the appropriate ones, are the ones that actually make a difference. And so it's fitting those tools and those measures, particularly for our organizations. And so it's actually listening to the conversation this morning really prompted me to reflect on that and think, you know, revisit and remind me of those drivers of this is why it has got to be helpful for our organisation to make sure that we can continue to deliver meaningful services. And so I just think that was a kind of general reflection. So, we couldn't have scripted the conversation any better, could we? So thanks, Matthew.
Can I put, hi Choi, can I put you on the spot and just come to South Korea, and how's all this that we've spoken about here from a very UK focus, how's that resonate with you? What's your feelings?
I'm sorry that I don't have the good experience for social accounting. So I want to study and I want to learn. So that's the reason why I joined here.
Brilliant. Well, that's great. No, that's fine. And okay, shall we? I'm conscious of the time. We're getting on towards 5 to 12. So might I come back to Sue and to Sean just to kind of begin a wrap up, really, and your reflections on the conversation and your thoughts going forward.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, like Lisa said, really interesting actually hearing it all. I think my main takeaway reflection from this last hour is never has this space been more important. I just come back to that, and I just think these conversations and dialogue that we have around trying to really tease out the right ways to work, the right ways to support people, the right ways to support organizations to, you know, account for the value that they're creating is really important. The other big piece for me, and it's something that's again sort of very much on my radar with my work, is the need to be thinking around environmental impact. So some of you may be looking at funding. So there's a community renewal fund that's coming through, which is ahead of the shared prosperity fund, which is some of the replacement for EU funding. There's a really strong focus around green and the government's focus on net zero and the need to evidence that environmental impact. So for me, it's interesting, I guess, is how this broader landscape is shifting with that environmental impact now starting to sit alongside social impact.
Yeah, I think for me, sort of what Sue was saying, this is just so important now more than ever, because things are shifting, things are adapting, people are having to innovate, and they're having to determine whether or not what they are doing and innovating with is actually achieving anything. But Sue referred earlier to the funding landscape and how a lot of stuff's been brought forward to adapt to COVID, and whether or not the next 12 to 18 months and beyond, whether or not there's still sort of some funding available for people out there, and is it a smaller pot that people are vying for, and therefore having the evidence of the impact that they are achieving is possibly more important because it is that smaller pot and everybody's sort of got to go for it. And so I think there's that element. And I think also talking before about the people's voice and in relation to the bigger impact measurement piece around Social Value Act and around those partnerships with local authorities, etc. And obviously when we do have the opportunity to try and engage in those conversations, appreciate we don't all have the resources to do it, but try and make our voices heard, because a lot of our organizations are the ones on the ground who are seeing the difference that that services can make, the issues that are happening in the community, the problems that we're all addressing. So make sure the voices are heard across the board to try and make those changes happen.
Yeah, and my reflections on listening to what everybody's said is we're feeling the challenge, we're feeling the a whole spectrum of challenges on our organizations, but I sense a lot of optimism. I don't sense any waning of determination, and I don't sense any waning of enthusiasm for social accounting and social audit as tools that are essential. We're hearing a lot about build back better and build back fairer. And anybody got any final comments that pick up? Are you optimistic? Is it a big opportunity? And do you feel social accounting is a pivotal part of it? See, I shouldn't have summed up with a question, should I? I should have just summed up, you know. I just didn't really feel equipped to be the final contributors to this conversation. So does anybody else want to just say a final word?
I'll go.
Thank you, Sophie.
As I'm quite new to the whole sector and coming from the private sector, I'm really excited, I think, where things are going, and I'm really excited to be involved. I do think from the past year, it does give people a different kind of mindset of the choices that they're making. And I think everyone's a lot more mindful as consumers of the choices that they're making and the impact that those choices are having. And I think it's quite an exciting time for the sector to recover from the past year. And I'm looking forward to what's going to happen.
Well, Sophie, thank you for concluding our conversation and our meeting so perfectly. And thank you, everybody. Thanks to Sean and Sue for your contributions. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Climate Crisis Workshop on the 23rd of June. Hope to see you all there. Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Matthew.
Bye.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sue. Bye. I think we've lost Brenda, actually. You still there, Brenda? That's all right.
Sorry, yeah, I was doing something else. So yes, I will leave. I will say thank you. I'm also somewhat new to the sector, but coming from the sustainability side, I think that the social value is incredibly important and is the missing piece in taking sustainability and putting it into everyone's lives. And as far as the measures, you saw in the comments, right now I'm really quite cynical. So when people talk about the construction industry, I know that they choose, because I did a little bit of consulting, I know that people choose what makes them look the best. And we don't have a consistent framework for people to do the measuring. But as one of you mentioned, it's not about the numbers, it's about the actual impact. And until we make a point of interviewing the people and really seeing what it is, we're not really going to be able to sell the full value to the people that need to be making this mainstream. So it's very time consuming, but having those right interviews with the people that are impacted is what really tells that story and gets people to start doing it. So that's my piece. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. Bye.
Thank you all.
Do you want to stop the recording?
Oh, I thought I had.
Oh, maybe.
Not.